How we doing, Prepper Nation history? John here. So the blazer, right? This thing gonna start getting emails before long, son. So a quick disclaimer for you folks here on the History Channel. Number one, thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing. I cannot tell you how many emails and how many comments I see. People saying, we love the wargaming, John, keep it up. We love the history, keep it up. And then they're not subscribed over here. And I'm like begging them, please, God, just come over here and subscribe. Take 2 seconds. And as we build the platform up over here, I can do more stuff. You know what I mean? So the disclaimer is this. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be out of town. I'm not going to be here to do Shogun Saturday. Okay, I got a writing thing down near the border of South Carolina. I can't get out of it. So I'm thinking, well, I need an hour-long video to plop in that time slot. And so full disclosure here, guys, at the History Channel, it's going to be this one. I'm going to change this intro up to something more Shogun Saturday, and it's going to rerun, basically. So you're under no obligation to rewatch it. I just wanted to let you know that. Let's get into it, okay? Let me get a drink of coffee. Let's talk about the causes of the American Civil War. Plural. There are more than one cause. And let me speak on this really quickly, because most people that are out here in the wild, you know, most Americans, they don't know why the Civil War was fought beyond slavery. They hear the term slavery, they just think it was fought over slavery. And what has happened, and this is honestly sad, but it happens a lot with history, is, you know, the Union States, the North, won the Civil War, and they took the other side of the story and they swept it under the rug. And then they turned their version of history into the gospel, and that's what people have been learning ever since. Our kids will go through school, they hear it's about slavery, they don't hear anything else about the Civil War. And it's that kind of nonsense that really led me to starting the History Channel in the first place. Here on YouTube, guys, if you're not subscribed to the History Channel, the link is down below. So anyway, what were the causes of the American Civil War? Slavery was a huge, huge part of the American Civil War. Okay, I'm not discrediting that whatsoever. Slavery is terrible. It always has been, it always will be. Slavery is happening today, folks. It's still happening in several countries around the world. It's pathetic. I hate it. It is one of the lowest forms of, you know, somebody that engages in the slave trade whatsoever is just one of the most lowest human beings I can think of. You know, there's not much worse, in my opinion, that you can do than to traffic or slave trade. It sucks. Human trafficking. So to clarify, back then there were actually 2 types of slaves. A majority of the slaves were Africans, and they were brought here. Spain and Portugal, they were tied into it big time. Spain is probably the largest, you know, belligerent when it comes to slavery. They were really deep into it. The Dutch and the English actually brought most of the slaves here to the United States, and they landed up in Virginia. And at that point, you know, they were auctioned off to wealthy landowners. How many people in the South own slaves? You're going to see numbers all over the place. If you Google this, if you Bing it, you would think that during the Civil War era, every single person in the South had the antebellum house, you know, just the fancy house and 500 acres. That's not true. Roughly, based on my own research and a lot of reading, roughly 20%, maybe a smidge higher, of people in the South owned slaves. And there were also white slaves. Guys, not only were people indentured servants, and they were treated not much better, in the South especially, but also in the North in the factories and things. But a lot of Irish, check this out, okay? A lot of Irish were actually slaves. People don't know that. In the colonies, what would happen was in Ireland, either they had been sentenced to a crime and they were shackled and they were put on a slave ship, or they owed a bunch of money, like a bunch of debt. And of course, that was a crime back then in Ireland, so they were shackled and they were put on a slave ship, and then they were sold in the colonies. So Ireland was making money off of its own people, its criminal types. Unfortunately, the African continent, they weren't criminals. These were people, these were families being kidnapped by their own people. And that's probably the worst part for me, okay, as a husband and a father. And look, I know it's hundreds of years later or whatever, but when you study history, you have to kind of put yourself into the context of what was going on at the time. You can't become that person no matter what you're studying, but you have to get into their head a little bit, and you have to understand what they had to go through, or do your best to try. So anyway, as a father, I cannot imagine, having a wife and having 2 or 3 kids and having my own country or, kings or whatever kidnap us, split us up, knowing you're never going to see your wife again, you're never going to see your kids again. You don't know if they're going to be okay. As a father, it's a paternal thing where you want to know your kids are safe. And you're no longer going to know that because they just got shackled and they just got put on this boat, heading God knows where. You don't know. You're not getting information. You're a slave at this point. And you're being shackled and you're putting on this boat, and your wife's being put here. You're never going to see your family again. Many folks that were kidnapped and sold into slavery didn't make the trip over. The conditions were just subhuman. What these people went through, I'm going to go ahead and say it, they went through hell. I mean, it was just total hell, guys. So please understand that as we're moving forward with our talk. Keep that in the back of your mind because, again, the Civil War did have quite a bit to do with slavery, okay? So when you look at the United States or the colonies, whatever you want to call it back in the day, some historians would argue that it was still the colonies. It wasn't like the true blue United States because we hadn't expanded out west yet. I call it the United States, but you'll hear some historians call it the Union. So when you look at things, what you're going to find is you're going to find industries in the North, particularly around your bigger cities like New York and Boston. And you're going to find, your farmlands in the South. There were tons of different crops coming out from the South. That was the economy. And again, up north, you had your factories. Your factories had used slave labor up until the point that mass immigration started coming over. When people started immigrating from other countries, these immigrants got here, they needed a job. And they were willing to work in horrible conditions for next to no money. There weren't unions or anything like that back then. So as this started to happen, these factories, the wealthy people that owned the factories, they really didn't have a need for slavery anymore. You don't have to put somebody in chains and force them to work if they're going to work for a dime a day in some of the worst conditions you've ever seen in your life. So all of a sudden, these factory owners, their moral compass began to change, guys. All of a sudden, they were against slavery. Now that they could make their money in another way, do you understand? Their hands weren't totally clean. When you study history, it's all thrown into the South's lap. There's hardly any mention of the fact that the Dutch and the English brought the slaves here. There's hardly any mention that these folks were kidnapped by their own people. And there's hardly any mention that the North had a huge responsibility. Their fingerprints are all over it as well. It just so happens that when people were immigrating into the United States, they weren't coming in through South Carolina, they were coming in through New York. And so that was a huge problem for the South, because the South had no immigrants, hardly at all coming in. And so they did, unfortunately, rely on slavery, which again sucks. Number 2, states' rights versus federal rights. You'll hear this on a lot of history channels. What does this mean exactly? Okay. Well, here's the deal. The Constitution is an almost perfect document. It's not perfect, but it's almost perfect. It's not perfect in the fact that when it was written, we didn't have 50 states. We had not expanded out fully. And I think that the people that framed the Constitution didn't really understand how big our country was going to become. So they really didn't get too specific when it came to, does the federal government have more power or do the states have more power? Right? There's some wording in there, but not enough, unfortunately. And it was an issue that was going to come up eventually, somehow or the other. I mean, you're only going to go for so long before you got to find out who's really in charge. If you've ever worked at a job and your manager's telling you one thing and your other manager's telling you something totally different, that's only going to go on for so long before those two managers come together and figure out who's running the show. Because you can't have two people running the show telling you totally opposite things. This is the argument in a nutshell for states' rights versus federal rights. Now, the issue, again, schools will tell you, oh, it was 100% about slavery. It did have to do with slavery. But this issue was coming up eventually no matter what. The reason it deals with slavery is as we begin to, the United States, expand west, we have these new territories coming in. It becomes apparent that these new territories are going to be coming in as additional states to the United States. And so all of a sudden, people that are in free states, they were called free states, the northern states for the most part, and people that were in slave states, the southern states, and I'm talking about lawmakers here, all of a sudden they realize we don't know who has more power. We don't know if the federal government, if most of the power is centralized there, or if the states have the power. And they immediately disagree. They start to disagree. Your northern states are like, well, you know, we need to centralize the power to the federal government. We need to get it to the federal level, son. That's who needs to be running the show. Many of your lawmakers from the South, you know, they were like, the states should be responsible for their own deal. You know, the federal government should have very limited control. And you're already, let me just say this, you're already, even way back then, starting to see the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, or the mindset form. Okay? Because you have one side saying, and again, it's hard to take slavery out of it because it had such a huge impact on the war. But if you can just focus right now on states' rights versus federal rights, you begin to see the two big parties forming, okay? Because you have the same thing going on today. You have your liberals saying, you know, Papa Joe will take care of us. Papa Joe's going to do everything for us. The people in the White House got our back, son. You see that sentiment even today with a lot of the Democrats out here in the United States. And then with a lot of conservatives, you still see the same sentiment. You know, tax us, keep us safe, and leave us alone, son. Let us do our own thing. I would argue, and this is just my opinion, that if we had we're talking about education schools. If local schools could come up with their own curriculum, we'd be better off. We would test higher across the board. But unfortunately, everything is coming now out of the federal government, and sometimes that's not the best way to do it. So anyway, rant over. I'm sorry, I digress. Let's get back into the Civil War. So the debates, every time a state was getting ready to be admitted, the debates were fierce. These lawmakers would go, and their supporters, they would go to these states and they would try to influence these states one way or the other. There were fist fights, there were stabbings, it got bloody, people were getting shot because, again, neither side wanted to cede control. You have to understand, and this looks really bad on the South, what I'm getting ready to say, okay? But I'm going to say it anyway, because it's the truth. The Confederate States, or the states that would eventually become the Confederate States, they were whining and crying about freedom, okay? Freedom, just leave us alone, let us be our own people, let us be free. And at the same time, they were enslaving people. So it's kind of double talk. I understand what they're saying about freedom, but I don't understand how you say that while you're pro-slavery, and that's just my opinion. Okay, so anyway, that brings us into key point number 3, the idea of freedom. The idea of freedom for the people that lived in the South, by and large, was totally different. And it brings us to a very important question. And that question is still relevant today, okay? If you're in Texas, let me just say this. If you're in Texas and you're part of the, what is it called? The Secede Texas movement, I'm going to ask you an important question. As Americans, are we free or are we not free? It's a very important question, okay? Are we free in the sense that if we use the Constitution and we go through the system the way we're supposed to, and a state decides, hey, we're ready to leave, son, we don't want any more of this mess. At that point, is the state free to leave? Because that's what freedom would indicate, okay? Or are they being forced to stay? And if they're being forced to stay in the Union, how is that freedom? If you can't leave the Union, if your states agree you want to leave, and then you try and leave, and the U.S. president sends troops down to force you to stay, are you truly free? If Texas tried to secede tomorrow, and they went through the entire process, I know they're always talking about it, but look, if they go through the entire process legally, that's very important. If they go through this process and they vote, and a majority of the people in Texas, for whatever reason, said, yeah, we want to leave. Then at that point, what do you do? If you're Texas, well, if you're free, you leave. And if you're not allowed to leave, you were never free to begin with. You understand what I'm saying? So this was playing now heavily into the minds of the lawmakers in the southern states. And that brings us to key point number 4, the framework of the Revolutionary War. So the South looked at it like this, okay? And I'm going to have to get on the Revolutionary War for a minute, and then we'll jump right to the Civil War. So with the Revolutionary War, the colonists were getting taxed to death, but the other big reason was the colonists felt like they weren't being represented, right? Because at the end of the day, they were still English citizens, but they really had no say-so whatsoever in anything English. They were just thrown out there basically to be taxed, is the way they felt. And that's one of the big reasons they revolted, okay? So the people in the South, the lawmakers, they looked at the Revolutionary War and they said, they kind of put themselves into colonist position. They said, hey, aren't we in the same position again? We're being told what to do by a tyrant in the nation's capital. We're being taxed, and we're getting ready to have no representation with these new states coming in. Now, of course, I would be all for slavery ending, but even after slavery ends, they still have no representation. Do you understand? They can't get any bills passed. They can't get any federal aid they need, nothing. They're going to have zero representation at this point. And so what they did was, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the stream and the podcast, is they kind of structured their leaving in the same fashion that the colonists did against the King of England. They were very careful about how they did this. They didn't just get mad and stomp their feet and throw everything down and go, son. They were very careful about how they did it, and they wanted to do it in such a way that they were going to do it legally. But the problem, of course, was there was really, the laws were kind of sketchy on that, again, states versus federal power. So let me just mention this very quickly. The Civil War gets underway. The Emancipation Proclamation, you guys know what that is, right? Number one, it only applied to Confederate states during the Civil War. In case you're ready to throw Abraham Lincoln up on your shoulders and hail him as the greatest president of all time, which I do not. I'm going to give you my opinion in a second. So he only applied this to certain states, number one. Number two, he wrote the proclamation. And some of his advisors were like, well, wait now. This isn't the right time to do it. We need to wait. We need to put this on the back end of a Union victory so it has more power. And so he actually carried this in his pocket for months. I would argue that in reading Lincoln's writings, it's obvious that he was anti-slavery. He didn't like it. But that he used slavery and he used the proclamation for political advantage and military advantage. He waited for the right time. Then he dropped this. And basically the right time was when the Civil War looked like it might be a stalemate. When it became obvious to him that we're not going to be able to end the war quickly. Then all of a sudden his heart started bleeding for the people that were enslaved, but only in certain states. And so just keep that in mind. So you have a bunch of fighting, you have a bunch of threatening, again, shooting and stuff like this between lawmakers. And finally, the lawmakers in the South, they have enough. There's getting ready to be an election. Lincoln is one of the candidates. He's not really favored to win. I mean, it's projected to be kind of close, but the South doesn't really think that Lincoln's going to win this thing. So they make the threat. They're like, if Lincoln wins, we're out of here. And maybe they were trying to do it to sway the election. It's really hard to say without having been there. But, they just said, look, we're leaving. We're not going to be here for a Lincoln presidency. Lincoln wins. And so now the South has painted itself into a corner. You're either going to lose face and you're going to suck it up and you're just going to look like idiots for making that statement and staying, or you're going to stick to your guns and you're going to go. And that's what they chose to do. South Carolina was the first to do it. But it was kind of a done deal in most of the Confederate states. There weren't many states that, that went with the Confederacy that were even on the fence. They knew they were leaving. It was just a matter of which state was going to go first. So they elect Jefferson Davis as president. Now Sherman was not the first general of the Union Army. I think it was McClellan. I would have to go back and pull it up. But he was the one that ends up He's the general when the war is over, okay? Robert E. Lee becomes, and this is sad, let me just say this, okay? I read a while back on the internet that most high school and college age kids right now in our country believe that Robert E. Lee was the president of the Confederate States of America. I mean, that's how bad our history programs are failing us in this country. One of the greatest generals, and we went over this last week, one of the greatest generals of all time, and people thought he was a president. They didn't even know he was a general. So that's just pathetic. But I digress. So he becomes the general for the South. And the biggest reason is he's from a political family that has deep roots in the South. And he believes the same thing that the Southern leaders believe, okay? He believes that, ultimately, as great as the country is, the states should have the right to do most things. The states are going to be able to, how can I put this? What kind of analogy can I use here, okay? So you work at a retail store, and you have a manager there, and you're surrounded by the same people every day, okay? You get used to things, and you begin to understand what works for your particular store. You know what times it's going to be busy. You know the employees you can count on. You just get used to the way things run, and you can run more efficiently when you're allowed to run your own store. However, you have like a regional manager, not Dwight Schrute, by the way, who lives and works 1,000 miles away. And this regional manager every single day calls you and tells you how to run the store. You guys need to do this today. This individual's never in the store, or very rarely. They have no idea the happenings of said store, but they're still dictating to you what needs to be done. This is the state versus the federal government, now and also back then. States can run their own stuff, but the federal government likes to, I think, overstep and start micromanaging and dictating and all this stuff. And the federal government's a mess. They can't even run their own stuff, but they're dictating to states what they need to run. So anyway, this is what Robert E. Lee saw. And he was originally offered, the job to lead the Union Army against the South. And he's like, nah, son. I believe what they believe. Ain't nobody got time for this. So he, declines or whatever. And shortly after, Jefferson Davis offers him the job to lead the Confederate Army, Both Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee went to West Point. There's so much difference between these two that it's ridiculous. When you look at these two generals, just saying, when you look at these two generals, Grant was the by the book type general. He did everything by the book. He did everything the textbook said to do. And it led to a lot of victory, but not a lot of, I would argue, prestige. Robert E. Lee was more of a gambling man when it came to military strategy. And that's why I think he's more remembered throughout history, is because he took more chances. And he, again, was a very, very good leader on the battlefield. But anyway, so that's how this gets set up. And of course, Appomattox Courthouse is really where the war ends. Robert E. Lee at this point, look, guys, Lee, let me say this, a Robert E. Lee-less Confederate Army would have fallen in 3 to 6 months. I would estimate 3 to 6 months. They would have made it much longer. But because Robert E. Lee was the general, and because Lee had a knack for spotting talent in officers, he knew who he could trust. He knew who the hotheads were. He knew who the gamblers were. He knew who the slow and steady ones were. Stonewall Jackson, he knew, I can trust Stonewall. If I give him a task, that task is going to be done. It's going to be done on time. It's going to be done the same way I would do it. You know, P.T. Beauregard, he knew this guy's a hothead, but I can use that to my advantage because this dude will march 1,000 guys against 100,000. He don't care, son. He's just reckless, but in a way that played to Lee's advantage. So, you know, at the end of the war, or right at the end of the war, Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's finally cornered. More Unions on the way. There's just no escape at this point. And this is where he cedes the war. What you will not learn in history, most history classes, public education ones especially, is Sherman's march. All right, General Sherman. So he took 60,000 soldiers. He goes into Georgia, and he's labeled the American father of total warfare. So to give you guys an example of total warfare, I'll kick it over here for a second to World War II. So during World War II, the British were trying to break the will of the German people. And look, a lot of countries did this. But the British, I'm just using this example. They were trying to break the will of the Germans. And again, the Germans would do the same thing to them. So rather than striking military targets, they took it to the civilians. And they just went scorched earth with bombers. I mean, they just leveled cities, entire cities, filled with civilians. And they were trying to make a statement. They were trying to really just make it to where people had no stomach for war. But Sherman was the first one really in American history to do this. Now, of course, he didn't have bombers, but he had 60,000 heavily armed Union troops. And he chose Georgia specifically for a couple of reasons, or three reasons, actually. Number one, they were very sympathetic to the cause of the Confederacy because, I mean, they were just diehard Confederates down there. The people would support, it was kind of an infrastructure. They would support the troops coming through. They would feed them, things like this. Number two, there was a ton of farmland in Georgia. And Robert E. Lee at this point, they had not cornered him yet, and they were trying to cut off his supply line. So they really wanted to start targeting farms and things like this. And number three, it was lightly defended. I think, without pulling it up, I think that there were a couple scattered Confederate groups, maybe 1,500 soldiers tops in each of the groups. You know, they would harass them, but they really couldn't stop that many soldiers. So Sherman had free reign on Georgia. He could go right in, he could do whatever he wanted to do, and he could hurt Robert E. Lee. And they did. They hurt Robert E. Lee, but they did a lot more than just hurt Robert E. Lee. They went through and they raped civilians all through Georgia. Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, I think. They were just going to march it to the sea. They were raping people left and right. They were shooting, civilians just to do it. They were stealing anything they could steal from homes. They were burning farmhouses down. Guys, they were setting churches on fire. There's one church in Milledgeville, Georgia. I think you guys can Google this. They actually went in, they set the church pews on fire. They poured syrup down in the pipes on the organs. It was total chaos. And they were trying to, history ain't going to tell you this when you pick up a book in school. But they were trying to punish these civilians in Georgia. The war by this point was already over. It was just a matter of time. They knew at this point we've won the war. So this was about punishing people for believing in something that they didn't believe in. And it was just Not a good time to be in Georgia. So people that are in the South, and I see this occasionally in North Carolina, I see a bunch of Tar Heel flags too, and I see a couple of them ratty Duke Blue Devil flags. But yeah, Tar Heels, baby. But occasionally you'll see a Confederate flag. And look, sometimes it is out of a place of ignorance, okay? Sometimes people that fly that flag are just ignorant and maybe racist, who knows? But there are also people that understand things, like Sherman's March. They're not going to forget it. They've studied history and they understand. And they're making the statement that, look, we know what happened. We know what you did. And the Confederate States of America, son, their hands weren't clean either. I mean, they weren't. There were a lot of Native Americans, believe it or not, with the Confederate States of America, because the United States of America sold their country. And they figured, well, hey, ain't no love lost, son. We'll sign up with the Confederate States of America. Maybe we'll get treated a little better. I don't know. But some of them did savage things as well to folks in the North. And again, the Confederates, the slavery thing is just unforgivable to me. Everybody in this war had dirt on their hands. But when you hear the official story in schools, it all gets dumped into the South's lap. And they certainly had a lot of fault for what happened. But they shouldn't bear all the fault, guys. It's from a historical standpoint, they get saddled with all of the blame because they lost the war. That's why. If somebody looks at this independently, it takes them 20 minutes of reading to figure out, the Confederates weren't the only bad people involved here. Both sides were bad. And you have to go back to that question that I said was very important. Are we free, or are we just under the illusion that we're free? So the states decide, hey, we're leaving. They use the standing legal system at the time, and then they declare, look, we're leaving. We're going to start our own deal, and we just want to be left alone. And Lincoln sends troops in. Lincoln, I told you guys what my thoughts are on Lincoln. A lot of people think he's the greatest president of all time. I disagree. I'm a Reagan guy. I ain't gonna lie to you. I think Lincoln is probably one of the worst 3 presidents that we've had. Okay. During World War II, we had one that served 4 terms, which is lunacy to me, son. Right? We've had one impeached and basically removed. Nixon, he's like, I'm out of here, son. And then we had Lincoln, who has the distinction of being the only president to go to war with his own people. Here's the problem, okay, from a historical standpoint. Here's a question that teachers don't like to try and answer. Here's a question that professors don't like to try and answer. And here's a question that some historians don't like to try and answer, because it blows up the whole idea of everything that you've learned in school. Okay? So when Lincoln sent troops, when Lincoln declared war, whatever you want to call it, was he declaring war on his own people, or was he declaring war on a sovereign state, another country? You can't have it both ways, right? So as president of the United States, he either launched a war against his own people here in the United States, his own countrymen, or he launched an illegal war against another country. Think about that. Which is it? You can't have it both ways. You can't celebrate this man in schools and think that he's one of the greatest presidents of all time if he went to war with his own people. And if he green-lighted things like Sherman's March against his own countrymen. Now, the flip side of the coin again, these people may not have been his countrymen anymore. They may have been their own country. And if they were their own country, the Confederate States of America, then this war was illegal. And this was part of Jefferson Davis's defense. Guys, again, Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. So after, it's all said and done, and Davis is on trial for treason. They arrest him. They're going to put him to death, baby. And, they've tried him with treason and all this stuff. So how did this whole thing end with Jefferson Davis? I would argue that it never did, actually. We all know what happened to Lincoln shortly after the war. And Lincoln was potentially smart enough to nail Jefferson Davis in court. Potentially. I personally think that Jefferson Davis still would have beat the charges, but Lincoln may have been able to do it. But after his assassination, Andrew Johnson takes over the United States of America. And Andrew Johnson doesn't know what to do, folks. He wants to nail Jefferson Davis to the wall. He wants to make an example out of him. But at the same time, there's an amendment passed in the Constitution now, a speedy trial, right? You have the right to a speedy trial if you've been accused of something. And there's no way that they could have nailed him to the wall with a speedy trial. They couldn't hold him forever. They really didn't know what to do with Jefferson Davis. And here's why. Jefferson Davis actually had a legitimate case. He was prepared to martyr himself in court and basically expose the whole states' rights versus federal rights argument. And Andrew Johnson did not want that smoke, son. He did not want states to wake up and realize, okay, the federal government's way too powerful. Jefferson Davis was held for so long that he started to get sympathy even from a lot of people in the North because they looked at him as, the convicted were getting speedy trials, but here you have Jefferson Davis just rotting in a jail cell because they have no idea what to do with him. And so ultimately, he was going to stir up a lot of trouble through the legal system, and he was going to bring a lot of, I would say, valid points to light in court. And Andrew Johnson knew this. He knew that, man, Jefferson Davis can shake this country to its foundation. He's going to be up here on trial, but he's going to be talking about, are we truly free? He's going to make the argument that the Confederate States actually did the same thing as the colonies, and we're going to end up looking really bad in court. Think about this, okay? How embarrassing would it have been for the United States to win the Civil War and then lose in court? It would have looked horrible, right? Public opinion, they definitely would have lost in court because Jefferson Davis had a very compelling argument. So Andrew Johnson eventually decides, hey, we're just going to let him go. We're going to let him go. We're going to smack him on the hand and say, you can't do that anymore, son. And they let him go. And the reason that they let him go is they're trying to keep him quiet. They don't want him talking about the Confederate side of the story. They don't want him in court because, look, if the man was going to be tried for treason, which is a high crime, and if he's going to be tried because of the Civil War, everybody in America is going to be reading about this trial. Every news outlet, newspaper, what have you, is going to be covering the trial. And that's a lot of eyeballs looking in on Jefferson Davis, who again had a decent argument. There was an argument to be made there legally. And so Andrew Johnson said, we're just getting rid of him. Let him go. Jefferson Davis is released. And he goes on, I think he took a job with an insurance company or something like that, heading up an insurance company. But he continued to write. He was always an avid reader, and he loved to write. And so he wrote several books. The guy was the president of the Confederate States of America, and he wanted people to know the other side of the story. You can't really find his work in many places now in 2021. It's been shadow banned. It's been swept under the rug. A lot of places won't cover it, and they'll say racism. We're not selling it. But the truth is, if you guys can dig up, it's called the Rise and Fall of the Confederate States of America. It was written by Jefferson Davis himself. This is not one of these deals where a celebrity hires, a shadow author to write the book and slap their name on the front of it. He wrote this book. And in this book, he explained, the Confederate side of the story. He explained why the Southern states chose to leave, why they believed they were their own country. And he uses legal framework in this book. And he makes his argument, the same argument that he was going to make in a court of law, he put into this book. And that's a big reason why it's shadow banned to this day, because again, how did this end? I don't think it ever did. I think the points that Jefferson Davis made in this book are still relevant today. Okay. Who should have the ultimate control over your life when it comes to government, okay? At the end of the day, you should have control over your own life, right? But he's talking about in terms of the government. Should the state decide what's best for the state? Should local communities decide what is taught in local school systems? Or should the federal government, which is hundreds or even thousands of miles away, should they be able to micromanage from a federal level? That's still relevant today, guys. And it should be a huge argument. It's really not. Most people after the Civil War, they just gave up and they submitted to the idea that the federal government is all powerful. When in fact, I would argue the Constitution and the country was not set up that way. It was set up, it was literally called the Union because it was a union of states. The states should have had the power, and this was their argument. One of the major arguments. Excuse me. And also, we get back to that same fundamental question. Jefferson Davis was asking it while he was sitting in jail. He wrote about it after they released him, and it's still relevant today. Put it in the most basic terms you want to put them in. All right? Are we free here in the United States? Or are we living under the illusion of freedom? Now listen, I love this country. I do, guys. I don't want you to think I'm anti-American. I'm pro-American 100%. I think it's the greatest country on earth by far, and probably the freest country in history. But we have some major flaws in this country, okay? And he was making the point again from a legal standpoint, okay? If, let's say, we'll use Louisiana, for example. I'm just pulling stuff out of the sky here. Louisiana. Let's say the residents of Louisiana are just tired of the United States and they want to do their own thing. And they take a popular vote, and a majority of the residents say, yeah, we're done with the United States. We want to do our own thing. And then it goes through the legal system at the state level, like it's voted on by representatives and things like this. And they do it legally. And it gets to the point where they've done everything they can do legally. They're ready to leave. And they submit a letter to the United States saying, hey, son, we're out of here. We did this legally. We tried it your way. We're not feeling it anymore. They're not going to be allowed to leave. The United States is not going to allow Louisiana to leave. And the primary reason for that is the tax revenue. Now, you can use any 50 of the 50 states you want to. The point is, at the end of the day, the United States looks at states as resources. That's tax revenue. And that's pretty much what the King of England was doing during the colonial period, okay? He was just throwing the colonies out there and collecting taxes, right? So the same argument can be made today. Folks in Texas are actually making it. There's some folks in California. There's a movement to secede California from the Union. And by God, if they got a GoFundMe, I'll put money into it. I'm totally okay if they leave. What do y'all call it? California? Some of you? I know there are some patriots in California. I get it. But the point is, are you free if you're not free to leave? If we are obligated to stay in a relationship that's no longer working out, and that would be the Union of the States here in the United States, if you're being forced to stay in that relationship, are you really free? That was the fundamental argument that Jefferson Davis was trying to make. He was on trial for treason against the United States, but he was making the point, look, man, I wasn't a part of the United States. We legally seceded from the Union. You guys bullied us, you sent troops, you forced us to stay. But we did not recognize ourselves at that point as citizens of the United States. So that was their argument. And again, that leads you back to the double standard that President Lincoln was pulling here, okay? You can't be the greatest president this country's ever had if you went to war with your own people and you green-lighted things like Sherman's March to the Sea. You can't be the greatest president that we've ever had when you send 60,000 troops through Georgia burning down houses and raping people. You just can't be, you know? And on the flip side of the coin, if the South was actually not a part of the United States and you want to wash your hands, and if Lincoln wants to clean his hands of this and say, no, I wasn't in the wrong here, then you illegally invaded the Confederate States of America. And this is the point Jefferson Davis was trying to make. He was going to say this in court. He was going to say, either we have a murderous dictator in President Lincoln that was responsible for all of these horrible things, or he sent his army into another country. Therefore, I didn't commit treason. He really had him beat over the barrel in court. And Andrew Johnson knew this. So again, he released Jefferson Davis. And, he kind of pivoted at this point. He wanted revenge so bad, but he knew he wasn't going to win in court. There was just no way. He was going to get to the point where the U.S. looked like idiots in court. They were really going to end up being painted as the bad guys here. Again, sympathy was starting to roll in from people in the North for, the Confederate States of America's president. So he's like, we got to get him out of here. This dude's a lightning rod. So they get him out of here. And they just want to squash this thing once and for all. And they pivot from, revenge to let's come together. Let's heal the nation. Let's go ahead and rebuild the South, right? Which is awesome because you guys burn it down in the North. Why wouldn't you rebuild it? So a lot of people, when it comes to the Confederate flag, a lot of people instantly see that and they instantly think racism. And again, in some cases, yes, some cases it is racism. But I would argue in many cases, it's people that have read both sides of the story and they understand some of the horrible things that happened here in the South. And it's their way of not forgetting what happened, not forgiving the U.S. government for what happened. If there's a lesson to be learned here, and again, I'm not anti-government, not anti-American whatsoever, but if there's a lesson to be learned here, guys, don't trust the government. The Native Americans will tell you the same thing. People that have studied the Civil War from a civilian standpoint will tell you the same thing. the U.S. government will do anything it has to do to stay in power. Again, with the Native Americans, they will lie to them about new land out here that's plentiful, and they'll march them until they die. That's how they did things back then, to save bullets. They will come into the South and they will punish people by burning down churches and homes and things of this nature. Don't trust the government. And you can spin this all the way back around if you want to. It's another topic for another day, but you can spin this all the way around to the Second Amendment. This is why the Second Amendment is so important, because if the Second Amendment goes bye-bye, then you're totally helpless, and you must at that point depend on the U.S. government. And the U.S. government historically has not been on the level. And this is John with Prepper Nation. The rant is over. In my opinion, these are the root causes of the American Civil War. If you folks have other causes in mind, if you would like to add to the conversation, feel free to email me, of course. The email is down below. Also, leave a comment. I go through all the comments and read them, guys. John with Prepper Nation, you folks have a blessed rest of your day.